Okay, good morning everyone. We are live, so we have got quite a number of people online who can hear us as well. And so welcome to them and welcome to you, the chosen few who first come, first serve, who were able to be here in person. So welcome to our latest forum, which is based on our latest market report, which was published back in December last year. So we're going to be, between the three of us, outlining the key themes and insights from that report, but also sprinkling in a few things which have happened since then, because 2 or 3 months is a very long time in the world, as we know right now. So today there are three of us: Mark Lacey, Rachel Coleman and myself, Steve Watts. Mark and I were co-founding partners of Alinea and now directors of Turner and Townsend Alinea. And Rachel has been our lead of our research team since the day we started back in May 2013, so she might be familiar to quite a number of you. So between Mark and I, we cover both research, knowledge and service for Alinea, but actually in terms of what goes into making up our market forecast and report, it's very much a team effort. So in various ways, every single person at Alinea is involved in that report, not least because Rachel ensures that there's a very close link between her team and the project teams across the business, and that's very much a two-way communication. So we're going to attempt to answer 3 key questions today. Why is everything so expensive, which Rachel's going to do her very best to cover, leading on to what does that really mean for London and London projects, which Mark will cover, and then I've got the bit about actually what can we do about it, and I'm going to try and inject a bit of positivity into that bit, because genuinely I do feel a bit of positivity despite all of the challenges that the world and our industry faces. We're going to hope to allow a little bit of time for some questions from the floor and online. I think Rachel, you might be monitoring some questions which are coming in online, and then at the end I'm going to remind you about some upcoming events too. So straight into it. Rachel, why is everything so expensive?
Thank you. I think I've got the easiest of it because no one can argue that everything is expensive. So I thought I'd start with the answer of just everything is incredibly expensive. This is our materials price tracker that has everything from fabricated steel, bricks, concrete, rebar, and you can really clearly see the kind of recovery from COVID, thank you. Then a nice little plateau when we thought everything might be getting better. Then this steep line is the war in Ukraine taking off and the eventual kind of settling higher. On the right hand side is wages. I think everyone's feeling wages, whether it's retail workers, construction workers, anyone is seeing huge wage increases. And that equates to about a 10% annual increase. So we're going to go into some of the reasons as to why those are happening. And we keep getting the question of why are construction goods increasing at a rate faster than CPI? You can see CPI, the purple line at the bottom, is fairly steep, but not as steep and variable as the construction materials. The first one is shortages, and I'm only really going to talk about labour in this one. We know we don't have enough of the workforce. Everyone's been focused on the drop-off since COVID and the kind of this section onwards, but I've wound my graph back to 2019, which is when we should have left the EU, and we've lost nearly 250,000 workers from the construction industry. But I like to put a bit of context on my numbers and take it back to 2006, when we had the last peak in output in 2008, and you can see that we're substantially smaller than we were then, despite the fact that output has recovered past that point. And when you look on the right hand side, the CITB, the Construction Industry Training Board, have highlighted the number of workers we need over the next few years, and that's quite a substantial amount just to support the known pipeline. So one of the reasons is that we have an unsecured workforce. There's an awful lot of construction workers that aren't directly employed, they're self-employed. This graph splits it out into self-employed at the bottom, employed at the top. There's 2 kind of interesting stories to come from this. The first is that the number of self-employed workers has fallen recently. That goes back again to that 2019 date, which I'll explain on the next chart. and the number of employed workers has gone up. There's a few things at play here. It's the IR35 rules are encouraging people into employment. COVID and Brexit have also played into there. If you're a bit unsecured, chances are you may well have been let go over the last couple of years. I think this switch from self-employed to employed may well help with our skills crisis a bit, because you're more likely to invest in someone if they're going to stay with you. Whereas if you're self-employed and can go down the road to another site, you're more likely to not want to train those people. This is kind of building the other interesting stories of 2019, I think. So we had a really close relationship with the EU. I don't think that's a surprise to anyone. A typical London construction site can be 90% EU workers. This is migration levels from the EU and non-EU, EU being the blue ones. You can see that we have had a substantial amount of EU migration up to 2016. And then since then, that blue line has been pretty much non-existent. It's been really varied as well. It's not as predictable as it once was, so we can't rely on that workforce coming back. There has been a switch to non-EU workforce coming in. This is general economy, this isn't construction, kind of in further levels that will be happening in construction as well. And that's a problem for us, because when you look at the breakdown of the construction workforce by birth group and age, all of the non-UK workers fill in this young worker group, so 25 to 34 years old, whereas our domestic workforce is very much the older workforce that are set to retire. That kind of leads you to the obvious assumption or conclusion that they're going to be more expensive because there's fewer of them, they need training, and there's a lot of investment that needs to happen in those skills. My second point is panics, which is all about materials. I think it won't be a surprise to anyone that there's been a few panics in materials recently. I've highlighted these because these are what we typically import from Russia, so wood, nickel, aluminium, rebar and diesel. I'm going to focus on these. So when you look at the amount of UK construction imports in 2021, admittedly this is still an odd year, this is a COVID rebound year, which takes out some of the predictable nature of it. But from Russia and Ukraine, we generally import about 12% of the UK's construction rebar. And you can see the other products there, but I'm going to focus just on rebar. You don't need to know the basis of the units of these numbers. We're just going to be looking at the number of countries that we import from. So this is from HMRC. This is the amount of rebar imported into the UK in the first half of 2021. And you can see that there's 15-ish countries. And because of the war in Ukraine at the beginning of last year, we had to rapidly diversify that supply to replace Russia, which was second on the list, and Ukraine down here. And so to replace that, we had to go to an awful lot more countries, which led to a little bit of a panic in pricing, with people thinking, well, we normally get our rebar from Russia and Ukraine, where can we get it from? I've got a little bit, I'm going to push the price up because everyone thinks we can't get hold of it. But then once those new supplies were found, the price rapidly came back down. It's still higher than it should be in, let's say, normal year, but it's a lot more stable now. So I think rather than a genuine shortage of materials, that was a kind of brief panic. And we've seen it everywhere, whether it's toilet paper, eggs, or currently tomatoes. We keep having these panics where it's more of a blip that gets kind of amplified by just consumers not acting normal. And my last point is modernisation, which is the way that the office and the built environment is changing. Each of those creates a little bit of a delay in decision making, and also just a point of pause and having to step back and consider what you actually want, whether it's your goods being stuck in the sewers and having to look at local sourcing instead. China's clean air policies means that we're just having to create generally better products that are less pollutant. Net zero, I won't read through them all, but it's just general ways of working and changing the way we build the office and occupy the office, and any change brings general price increases while everything settles down. And my insolvencies point, I think this is more a point of context. I like context in presentations. Everyone keeps asking about administrations in the construction industry and whether they're increasing and should you be worried. So I've put this graph back to 2012 so that we can have that context. And you can see that they're actually quite low at the moment, because I don't think it's the number of them that are important, it's the type of them that matter. The construction industry is an awful lot of small businesses that come and go. And so it's not, we've seen kind of the rebound from COVID, increasing the number of insolvencies, but it's largely small businesses, one-man bands in regional areas. Courts were closed in 2020 and 2021, so they couldn't take place, which has bumped them all into this year and given us a bit of a false high recently. But what we're trying to understand now is not the number of companies that are becoming insolvent, but the type of them. Is it one that's going bust and leaving behind millions of pounds of debt, or is it someone that's just disappearing and those people will be reemployed somewhere else? And then my final point, which I'll hand over to Mark afterwards, is on demand. Because I know a lot of people are wondering, well, the central London pipeline for offices has fallen away quite dramatically over the last couple of years. There's been that lack of confidence, and we keep seeing the idea that demand is slipping, and Mark will pick up on that later. And we know that there's more availability in the London office. So where's all the capacity gone? If we're talking about shortages and panics over materials, that doesn't look representative of that. And so I'll tidy up this really messy chart in a second, but this is construction output based back to pre-COVID, just so you can see where the recovery is. And I want to pick up on these 4 lines. So the black line through the middle is all new work. I've avoided all of the repair and maintenance because I don't think it's useful to know if someone's replacing their windows. The purple line of commercial at the bottom includes offices, retail, dining, all those things. It's not just offices. You can see it's really lagging at the bottom, but it's kind of flat, it's not falling. But the main kind of storytellers are the 2 at the top of private, industrial and infrastructure. So we know that the government has a commitment to build its way out of COVID. Also, we've just got a store of work that needs to be done that seems to be finally being built. We've got large infrastructure projects coming forwards, and that's where the demand is shifting to. And we've heard that played back to us a few times, that contractors are more likely to try and look at these kind of sectors. So the logistics market is going great guns and trying to keep up with the broader storage that everyone needs, and retail storage, data centres. Everyone's using more data, so therefore people need more data, despite the fact it's incredibly expensive to supply. There's a huge demand for it. And I put Hinkley Point here just as an example of the infrastructure sector, and just the sheer number of people that it's employing, 8,500 people on site. Is much bigger than a London construction site, and it's a longer programme of work. It's more secured, maybe has higher wages, better staffing, supplies. So why is everything so expensive? We don't have enough of the things we need. We have a very opaque nature that you don't really know what's being bought and sold. It's all he said, she said. We just haven't dealt with the skills crisis. We've been warned about it for a long time. And we have a build-up of problems. So I put a news article here from 2015, just saying that the economy was slowing. I think we all forget that 2020 to 2023 was bad, but 2015 to 2020 was also quite bad. We went into this in a weak place. I think by the time we were saying that contractors were cutting their margins to try and win work and take on some of the losses that they were seeing, that meant that they went into these crises just with no buffer. And so they're having to push on the price increases. So this is the point of context again, that we need to look back and see what happened before. So I'll pass on to Mark to say what I need to London.
Thank you, Rachel. Good morning, everyone. You 2 chaps want a seat? There's space at the front, or you have the called you out and embarrassed you. I'm so sorry. Good morning, everyone. So I'm going to try and pick up on what Rachel has started. I'm going to talk about the pipeline, market sentiment, what we're seeing in terms of evidence in pricing, our forecast, and also our thoughts for 2023 and potentially 2024. I'm going to start with this slide and the headline of a few weeks ago, because we think this is going to be really interesting for us, because not only is infrastructure a larger sector by volume than any other sector in the UK, as Rachel has talked about, but its pipeline is more sustained, projects are significant. And when you think about that against the context of our Central London project and the logistical challenges of a Central London site, the nature of the contracts, the risk, the procurement constraints, the supply constraints, it's a very attractive sector, and arguably with more favourable contract terms. And in the past, we've spoken about the draw of these projects on the London market, as Rachel's talked about, and how they suck in labour, materials, and in effect have a profound effect on pricing locally here in London. And we in the past have talked specifically about the number of piling rigs that are needed on the sort of older common site, and that's sucking at demand in London. There's a lot in the press now about concrete. I wonder what will come next around trades like steel and MEP as these projects start to move into the sort of latter stages. And we've been aware of, for some time, of a lot of trade contractors that we engage with and talk to refocusing their businesses to some extent away from the London market into some of these regional markets where there's greater security of organisations being able to secure pipeline. And perhaps, I mean, Rachel talked about historically 90% of London labour being sort of non-UK EU based. I think that figure now is arguably probably about 50%. And that says to me that labour is quite transient, and labour will follow and chase areas of the country where arguably it's the cost of living is less, it's easier to live, it's easier to get to work, and there is more sustainable pipeline of work for labour to be put to work on. But what we're going to try and do going forwards in our next market briefings, given our sort of collaboration merger with Turner and Townsend, is we're going to bring a lot more of that infrastructure market insight into this room and into our market paper to really understand that in a lot more detail, because it is going to have an increasing impact on the London market going forwards. I'm going to talk about demand very briefly. And this is a sort of graph extract from the Deloitte Crane survey published in Q4 22. And as Rachel has alluded to, new starts in London are below the average. There's a continued shift towards reinvention and refurbishment driven by the carbon agenda and planning constraints. But equally, there's a sort of flight to quality, and that's the phrase that we get talked about by our clients. But that said, trying to put a bit of a positive spin on this, developers do continue to press ahead with their schemes, and we haven't had anything significant really pause yet. But equally, there are viability challenges, which I'll come back and talk about later. So what will 2023 bring? Well, I think that headline's far from positive. And again, I'm going to try and be a bit more positive than grim. I don't want to be. I always like to put a positive spin on things. But I think the way that I would summarise it is we're probably in for a turbulent sort of 12 to 24 months, and certainly from main contractors, and there's a few in the room today, principals of organisations, and trade contractors that we talk to, sentiment is really varied. And I think the void in the commercial pipeline that the previous slide alludes to, I think the trade market can see that and sense that, and sort of the feedback that we're getting through trade contractors through our construction management projects reinforces that. But that said, some sectors are really buoyant. For us, the life sciences sector is really buoyant. The data centre market is really strong. That's private sector money. And we've talked separately about infrastructure and other sectors outside of London. But our sense is that there is going to be a sort of lull in the commercial pipeline for 2023-24, and I think the supply chain are very focused on that. They can see that, and there's going to be a sort of a real sort of focus towards securing turnover as we move through the course of this year. So what are we evidencing this by in this office right now? there's no doubt that existing contracts are under stress from procurement contracts that were engrossed 12, 24, 36 months ago, and that will continue to be a pressure for some time. Our phone is ringing an awful lot more, not only from main contractors, but as I say, from trade contractors wanting to find out about our projects, what's pressing ahead, what's moving. And we're seeing a lot of pricing strategies in tenders where in the sort of two-stage you'll see a market as we go through package procurement. Trade contractors are pricing projects tactically to try and grab the attention of us and the client, get the foot in the sort of door, so there's a potentially advantageous position to take forward during the tender process. We're seeing very large spreads. Some trades are definitely hotter than others. On the correct thing, I think the MEP market needs a lot of close focus going forwards, and we're seeing shifts in how we procure MEP to try and lock in the right supply chain partners. And I guess there's this point about I don't think this point about COVID and the Ukraine crisis hasn't gone away. There's still a lot of nervousness about future price risk and the point at which you lock that in and convert that. And equally, items that are on long lead need real focus to guarantee the supply. But this point that Rachel alluded to about headlines, I think it's really important to look beyond the headlines. A lot of press about material prices constantly rising, constant pressure. Well, as Rachel has alluded to, there in some instances there's been quite a bit of flatlining around that, and I'll touch on that when I talk about our forecast in a short while. This is a slide extract from the BCIS, BCIS Building Cost Information Service, a subsidiary of the RSCS. Myself and Rachel sit on the Building Cost Information Service QS TPI panel. It's the panel that receives the survey information from the cost consultant, engages with the BCIS in terms of the data and the evidence that they get from tenders, and then that panel collectively agrees the historic price movement and what the future forecast is. And I just thought I'd show this slide. In some respects, it's academic as to what the sort of the rate of OHP here is, and you may well be sitting there thinking, well, I bought it better than that on my project, so that's great. But actually, the point I want to talk about really is the sort of the fact that the arithmetic mean and the sort of median is showing a declared downward trajectory, and that's in declared contractors OHP within tenders. And clearly, that's a view nationwide across 12 cost consultants. And separately, this is another slide from the BCIS. And what this slide illustrates is the tender price index cost movement from that panel for the fourth quarter 2022 of last year. And what you'll see is that the panel, generally towards the end of the year, material price pressure eases. A lot of material price pressures come through the start of the year. What you'll see is that prices there was still price pressure towards the end of the year, and we believe that was largely driven by labour. So I was going to talk very briefly about the evolution of our tender price forecast. There's quite a bit on this chart, so bear with me. Firstly, at the top of the slide, you'll see July 2022. Well, that was our forecast that we crystallised in the middle part of last year, which took on board what we thought, believed, analysed, saw was the impact of the sort of Ukraine crisis. And I'd also say probably 6 to 8 weeks prior to that, we probably felt that figure was probably running at potentially double that. So I think that's where we calibrated at that point in time. The market price generally for the TPI had recalibrated. We then started to see materials price pressures ease during the sort of middle to latter half of last year. And at that point in time, we didn't really think that we'd be moving our forecast or our TPI up for the year. But then having published our market report towards the end of the year, a lot of analysis around labour, which Rachel has talked about, in effect, what we felt we needed to do was to move our forecast up from 8% to 9% for 2022. And in effect, what you will see is that we brought 1% forward from 2023 into 2022. And we did that for all the reasons that I've just explained about where we sit here now and the challenges that we're facing this year. We just didn't see this year, for all the reasons that I've explained, being as hot as last year. So my final slide, what will sort of 2023 and 2024 bring? We do anticipate the sort of pipeline becoming clearer as we move into the spring. And I think there'll be a greater degree of certainty around which projects will proceed and move forwards. And as I say, you know, at the moment we are still reasonably positive for the reasons that I've talked about. But there is this void in starts coming, and output is forecast to be lower in commercial and residential. I think the uncertainty that we're seeing in the market will help, and please, the contractors in the room can forgive me for this, but they will help keep a lid on contractor pricing. I'm not saying that we're not anticipating materials price pressure and the actual hard costs we're seeing not being passed through, but I think it'll just keep a lid on margins and the sort of commercial tension existing in the nature of doing business. Contractor stress and the historic material price pressure does worry us. And I think it worries a lot of our clients, and I think that worry is well placed. And perhaps the sort of final point, just to sort of finish on, is the sort of the challenge of differentiating commercial schemes and this flight to quality that I've talked about, and the sort of challenge of, you know, the challenge around rents and yields versus the cost of investing to differentiate, versus the sustained cost pressure. There's a sort of cocktail of issues there that are all competing, and I think it's going to be the really smart developers and their teams that come up with good schemes and can navigate through that will see those projects proceed successfully. So that's all for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. So I said at the beginning I'll be talking about what we can do about all of that, and I've sort of split my section into 4 key areas, and those key areas are really things that I think present an immense challenge to the industry, but I'm a great believer that where there's a challenge there's an opportunity. The first one is productivity, and anyone who's listening to our Chancellor Jeremy Hunt at the moment would know that he's trying to encourage over 50-year-olds to return to the workforce and off the golf course and help with this subject. But given that the UK is performing poorly, but also despite the fact that we've lost people from across a range of sectors, I don't think that is the answer. Because one of the fundamental flaws of the UK is its poor productivity record. And even worse than that is that construction is bottom of the class. And this is a study by Oxford Economics that the Productivity Task Force cites in a very clear way as to one of the reasons why we really need to improve productivity and at the same time improve trust in the industry. And those two things are clearly very related. And that you can see that shows that between 1997 and 2019, the average reduction in productivity in construction was 0.6% per year, which is quite a startling figure. Now, I don't know the backgrounds of that figure and how fair it is, but even so, it's a startling figure. In some ways, I'm actually stealing Mark's thunder here because Mark and Marissa Stenning from Alinea have been part of this working group, which, as you can see, covers a spectrum of representatives from the industry, from clients, main contractors, consultants, and trade contractors. And they've been working quite a bit of time, years I think it is, isn't it, Mark, on producing this. And if you haven't read this, for those of you online, you can't see it, but this is the Private Sector Construction Playbook. To its full title, Trust and Productivity, the Construction Sector Playbook. And that is the result of these guys' work to date. And it's quite revealing and a very, very interesting read. They've spent a lot of time reviewing projects which found their way into this book in the form of case studies. And it's really good in the way that it distills the issues into these 10 drivers for success. I'm not going to talk about these in any detail at all. All I do is to recommend that you read that application if you haven't already done so. But what it does is that it relates those 10 drivers for success across a project life cycle from concept to delivery. And actually, one of the things this does do for us is actually it just reinforces the mantra that we've been saying for the last 10 years or so, is that a lot of these things aren't rocket science, and a lot of these things are related to behaviours and to setting up projects correctly, and that's a key thing with this publication. The second issue is sustainability. We know that the industry has made great strides in the last few years into making our projects more sustainable, despite the immense challenges that come with that. And we know that occupiers are demanding better and greener buildings, but what that is doing is that it's increasing the volume of redundant space. Now, if you actually look at our benchmarking data, there's a very clear, I think, delineation between projects which were designed, say, 5 years ago, to stuff which is currently on the drawing board with a real step change in cost, because probably there's been a step change in the office product. And offices now have to deal with all of this stuff. Designers have to contend with all the stuff that they normally do in terms of making that building fit for purpose, fit for its occupiers, efficient, cost effective, responding to the various and increasing planning constraints and challenges, but also, of course, making it sustainable and contending with a whole plethora of guidance and legislation. But I think there's a positive side to this, in that the starting point now is, do we have to demolish? And can we retain at least part of the existing building? And this is an excerpt from a study we did with SOM late last year, which looked at 4 scenarios, bookended by simply refurbishing the existing building to actually completely demolishing and renewing it, to some various options in between that. And what's interesting about this is that I've got a project in the City of London at the moment where, in collaboration with the planners, we're doing exactly that in a very transparent way. So we're running through this process of looking at 4 scenarios, and we're just starting that process of assessing both the carbon, whole life carbon, and cost of those 4 options, so that we can go on that journey with the planners in a very collaborative way. And I'm absolutely convinced we'll see more and more of this. Third one is innovation. And I think, given the challenges of the last few years, our industry has become more innovative, necessarily so. But given that last slide, one of the ways that we are becoming, and will need to become more innovative and imaginative, is in the way we reuse existing buildings. Now, I could have chosen a few examples from London, but I thought I'd choose one that probably you're less likely to know. This is Key Quarter Tower in Sydney, which was changed from that building on the left to that on the right, designed by 3XN, BG&E structural engineers for AMP Capital. I should say also Multiplex for the main contractors. They demolished a third of that floor plate for the full height of that building. They retained 2/3 of the core, and in the process of all that, they doubled the floor area of that building. Incredibly successful, no doubt logistically challenging. But as I say, I think we're just going to see a lot more examples of this sort of imaginative reuse of existing buildings. That, by the way, I didn't know this until yesterday, was voted the best worldwide project in the world by the World Architecture Festival in Lisbon last year in November. Closer to home, that playbook also notes modern methods of construction as a key theme going forward. Modularisation is an example of that. 10 degrees in Croydon by Tide Construction. I think it still is the tallest modular building in the world, because it's just about to be overtaken by that building, which is right next door by the same contractor. I'm not sure if it's topped out yet. But Alex and Hyams, who leads our residential team, and I went to see that building a few months ago. It's actually really good, really high quality. You never guess from the outside it's fully modular, but it's living proof of all of those theoretical advantages that MMC can bring, which are cited in that report, happen. That is a 44-storey building with 2 levels of basement that was delivered in 26 months. Something like 80% reduction in vehicle movements, 60% reduction in people on site. So not only is a programme and a cost benefit, there's a sustainability benefit as well. And of course, it's easy to forget some of the incredible work that some of our trade specialists have been undertaking over the past few years. Concrete Zero is one example. There are others. And the way in a relatively short period of time, most of our cost plans now allow for GDBS concrete. I suspect at some point in the future it'll be earth-friendly concrete. So we'll be moving forward, and concrete's just one example of that. And again, referring back to that construction playbook, involving these sorts of specialists earlier on in the conversation. I would say not just in earlier on in the project conversation, but between projects, just staying close to the guys that are actually building our projects is essential. And finally, I've termed it resilience. This is sort of every time we do a presentation on the market, we tend to throw up this slide like this, which tries to represent all of the shit that we've had to contend with over the last few years, from COVID to the war in Ukraine to the climate emergency. I could go on and I won't. And by the way, not forgetting that the recommendation from the Granville report is going to come out at some point soon, which will have its own implications. But actually, the resilience of the industry, and in particular supply chain, in contending with all those issues has been remarkable. And it's perhaps no coincidence that with my Council for Tall Buildings and Urban Habitat hat on, that last year the best tall building in the world was a mere 52 metres tall. This is the David Rubenstein Forum in Chicago. Actually, it is still relatively tall given its immediate surroundings, but the reason that was voted was it's a fantastic design that really plays to the function of the building and its occupiers, but in a very efficient way, and the real logic to that design and its structural efficiency as well. Fantastic building. So, as a CTBH, we're very cognizant of the fact that it's not all about tall, shiny new buildings. And again, when I relate back to this report, it sort of reminds me that the industry does need to modernise. Innovation is essential, but at the same time, some of the stuff that will make our projects successful is really going back to basics. And I'll just repeat the one word I said earlier, and that's behaviours, working together. For us, that is without doubt the key difference between success and failure. Well, I'm going to finish on a really positive slide, which is this one. So on Boxing Day, my family and I came to London. We spent the day in London, and we went, my wife and I in the morning went to one of our tall buildings and had breakfast there. We walked up the steps at the monument, which we'd never done before. We took a boat down to Battersea Power Station, and some of the family went ice skating, some shopped, and I watched them whilst having a very nice bit of mulled wine. But it's really, that whole day was a reminder that actually this is what we do. This is the reason we do this, with the buildings and the spaces between them that we produce, is to put a smile on our faces. So I thought I'd just finish with an uplifting slide with you. Very nice, interesting questions. So, questions. I don't know, Rachel, if you have noted any online. None at all. Anyone with any burning, or just disagree with anything we have to say, or violently agree, do either? Yes.
You talked about resilience. I wondered how contractors are protecting themselves from inflation, and whether we might lose large large parts of the construction industry.
Okay. I think, and perhaps some of the main contractors in the room could comment. I think main contractors try to protect themselves from the risk of insolvency by, I think, becoming increasingly more sophisticated with the supply chain partners they'll do business with and who they will lay risk off to. And certainly we've talked in the past about the sort of nature of the industry being one where, what a main contractor provides as a sort of management service and a risk, the knowledge, the skills to bring the whole thing together. But I think that the fundamental challenge, Oliver, is that the industry is very fragmented. And we, in the past, did a study with Mace, where we went and back analysed how many trade contractors were employed on the MEP packages on the Shard. And most people who are not in construction would think, well, that's easy. You've got a mechanical guy, an electrical guy, a ductwork guy. Jane, I think it was something like 65 to 70 separate trades, points of risk, subcontracting. So I think trade contractors, when you get down to the level below the main contractors and they're in a place where they are needing to win work and win turnover, I think I think that's a very difficult part of the industry. And not only are they looking ahead in terms of managing contract risk, but they're looking behind in terms of where all their fragmented supply chains are coming from and where they're procuring the materials from. I think it's very difficult. And I think it's something that the industry needs to get to grips with better.
I think it's something we should ask the main contractor. I see Jed and both Paul here. I don't know if you want to say that.
Yeah, I think the supply chain fragility is a huge issue here because traditionally we've been used to relatively stable inflation, been able to give fixed price contracts, go through a normal single stage or two-stage process, progressively build up the price, knowing that you've progressively got the buy-in from the trades behind you. You don't have that anymore because now the supply chain will only give you a very limited fixed price. So actually, by the time you've gone through your whole procurement process, those tenders aren't valid anymore. So you have to go through a further validation process immediately before signing the contract. You've then got to effectively tie those all in immediately you sign the main contract. But that's only as good as is the supply chain still there when you come to build it. And first-hand experience, we've had two instances where we've done everything as we would normally do. We've done the checks and balances on the supply chain, we've placed the orders, etc., etc. But if that trade contractor isn't there, you are at the mercy of whatever the current rate is. And I think that's a new world for us because the volatility is the challenge. I think the pricing level is a challenge for the clients because obviously that affects the viability of the scheme, but it's the volatility of pricing that affects the delivery companies.
Would you agree with us, Paul, that volatility has dampened to a degree?
It's dampened a little bit, yes, for sure. I think there was a question mark in the last 2 or 3 weeks about rebar and what the impact of the earthquakes in Turkey could have brought to the market. That doesn't seem to have been as bad as we feared it might be. I don't know, Rachel, has that impacted anything?
No, I haven't heard it's moved anything significantly.
Yeah.
I think because people know that they can move around a lot easier now.
Yeah, but there is, historically, there was a fairly significant supply of rebar from Turkey, but that was just a sort of. But I think the whole thing about the supply chain has been a succession of bad news. So you go from Brexit, you then go to COVID, you then go to reverse charge VAT, effective balance sheet, you then go to Ukraine. The trade contractors' balance sheets, I think, have just progressively got weaker and weaker and weaker over the last 5 years. And I think selfishly from a main contractor perspective, insolvencies always lag pain. You can survive the pain for a while, but it always catches up with you eventually. And for us, insolvency in the supply chain is our #1 risk at the moment.
Just to add into that, I think I agree with what Paul just said there. I think what we're doing more as a contracting organisation is probably exactly what Paul said, as well as we are chasing materials and contracts with other contractors. So we should have got a line of sight to the actual materials. The materials will be best if secured early on in the process. But we are planning certainly those finishing trades people will not hold their prices for a year or two down the line. They just won't take that risk given all the volatility recent. So like Paul saying, we have to go back to back with trades very quickly. As soon as we get an order, we're placed on orders. They need to be back to back with all those key trades and trying to ensure they secure the materials. And we know those materials are.
And I guess, Jed, that plays to that fragmented point about the industry, the multiple layers, and knowing ultimately who's placing the order and where the goods and materials come from, which is the point I made about know your points of supply, I guess.
The level of subcontracting is huge, Mark. Absolutely.
And it's not necessarily proven, unfortunately, in sort of the MEP world, it still remains very, very fragmented.
Sure.
I think one of the things very interesting to talk about is that the industry does evolve and what the industry is trying to do. But of course, that off-site fabrication, maybe 5 years down the line, will give us much more security.
Sure.
So you've got line of sight materials and products itself. But that's a maturing part of the industry, really, for sure. But it's not fully there yet.
Okay. Any more questions?
Let me go on 3 if I may. One for Rachel and Mark. I'll ask all 3 and just throw it out there. PCIS data, historically, that's been more public sector than private sector. I don't know if you'd like to say what proportion of the data you had on the screen there was public and private. That's the first part of it. Second part, unrelated, productivity. There's a lot of stuff going around MMC and all that good stuff, the car industry, let's make it in a factory, deliver it to someone. Yes, great. But for me as an SMC sort of client, SME client, the 2 to 3 years before I get to site, in the ladies excuse me dance of planning, rights to light, party wall awards and all the other nonsense that goes on, stops me crystallising a delivery package. It's always free beer tomorrow, guys. We're talking to a lot of people, but we can't actually sign a contract. So when are we going to start to look at the productivity of the interface with, I'll call it the public sector, which frankly I think is a disgrace at the moment. And the third part of the question is, I've forgotten because I'm grey-haired. I sort of answered it really. It's about productivity. What can we do about improving the productivity actually in the construction phase? Because it's, to me as an SME, it's more about reliability and deliverability. If someone says they're going to do something in 36 months, I'd really like it in no more than 38, guys and girls, not 48, as we've experienced on a couple of jobs recently, extenuating circumstances, I know, but it's about the solidity of the delivery package. And I think the industry has got a lot of things that it needs to address on that. And as a Spurs stadium, I'm a fan, missed its deadline. I built Wembley, it was a year late. There's a whole thing about reliability. If you say 48 months, it's 48 months, guys.
Right, so I think I've just sparrowed over the first part of the question, which was PCIS data, which I'm going to hand over to the two PCIS experts.
So you're entirely correct that it used to be entirely public sector focused, and I think to a point the future forecasting is still public sector focused, because the way they largely do that is bills of quantities and what do you expect to happen to those. But the real change has come in the last couple of years with the panel that they've created, which is largely private sector QSs who get together and talk about what they have seen over the last year and over the last quarter. And that is usually 90-odd% private sector projects, which is why I think the retrospective index has got an awful lot better and their forecasting is still quite poor. I think they've got 1% in for this year. So that's reflective of that split. So that the historical index up to today is mostly private sector focused.
On the productivity point, I'll come to one very personal anecdote, but also I'll start with I'm just so passionate about this. I know I keep saying the same thing, but setting up projects correctly, getting the whole team in the same room at the same time, so that you're absolutely clear on the objectives and the constraints and what success actually looks like at every reader stage going forward at the beginning. It sounds so simple, doesn't it? But so often that doesn't happen, and I think there's so much wastage which happens in our industry because that doesn't happen. The second thing I'd say, my personal anecdote, is I'm having a little annex built at home, and we chose the contractor not on price, and he's brilliant, and I'm really pleased we chose him. He's fallen down with two of his trades, one of whom ordered the cladding too late, still waiting for the cladding. We're 4 weeks in delay, just a really simple thing, planning and programming. The second one was, I came out of my house on a Sunday morning and I could hear this crashing on the floor. What's happening? And the roofer is up on the roof and he's throwing all of these tiles off the scaffolding onto the floor, smashing. What are you doing? He said, oh, well, we've got all these tiles left over. Don't need them. So I'm just throwing. I mean, there in a microcosm of the problems in our industry, attitude. Yeah. The wastage. Maybe those two things are related, aren't they? Yes.
The prompt payment code came out in 2017 and it's due to expire next year. Or they may extend it and add things. Do you think it's made a difference? Should we keep that as an industry, or the government keep it, where major contractors are required to explain the number of days it's taken to pay their trade contractors? Do we think it's been a benefit? Should it be extended?
I could see you looking at Jed, and I was going to ask you. Well, to start with you, Jed, do you think it's made a difference?
In part, I suppose, yes, it has. I mean, I think all the major contractors generally have pretty good pays on the whole anyway, so I think it's not necessarily a problem with the major contractors. Probably it's further down the supply chain that payment can be an issue. So I think we've always generally been quite good. But yeah, no, I mean, the visibility of it is very hard, but I'm not sure whether it's working down the supply chain. I mean, what I would say in terms of, payments generally, I'm changing the subject all that. But one thing I think the industry does need to tackle is retention. We talk about cash flow in the industry. There's still a £5 billion tied up in the industry in cash that's sat in other people's bank accounts, where people would benefit from that. And that's probably one of the factors we don't talk about.
What's the alternative to retention? I'm a client. And the only thing that if you take someone by the pound notes, his heart and mind will follow. All the guarantees in the world won't get them back to fix a door that's fallen off. I don't see another alternative. I really don't.
Yeah, I can relate to that in my personal job as well.
I know, we'll box it in.
Okay, we might have time for one more question, yes.
I was just going to say, you talk about productivity, and I think productivity starts with design. We talked a lot about the construction process, but before we get to construction, there's a big opportunity to do a lot more about making construction easier to do by having the proper design thinking about the buildability and the process that comes later. And so that early supply chain involvement we talk about could help that. It's difficult to do with the contractual and commercial constraints that we operate in and commercial tension that we need to retain. So just wondered if you've got a view on design and design productivity.
Something that we mentioned in our paper probably 2 years ago now, since it was productivity.
I think perhaps the example that I cite around that, where I think a client that we're working with at the moment, and indeed Andy Brown of G&T is also working with the same client, the GPE, on 2 projects. And on those 2 projects, the intention is to bring the supply chain on board a lot earlier in the process to ultimately get to a fixed price contract, but to do it in a much more transparent way, where certainly trades including MEP are brought on board during stage 3. I think that's a really positive move. there's a sort of transparency around estimating the cost of construction at stage 3, not contractually, not a hard GMP, and ultimately knowing where you're going in terms of embodied carbon and how you're going to build the sort of building. And I think it's quite an interesting approach. I think it's very, it plays to a lot of the points that are in the trust and productivity playbook. I think GP have been quite public in putting out there what they've done about that on their Aldermanbury Square project. And I think those sort of steps and those sort of initiatives will have some benefits in the London market. And I think the trade market will respond really positively to that sort of approach.
So before you go, just to make you aware of some upcoming events, not an event, but an article. So we have written an article on the EPC minefield that might be coming our way very shortly, which will be published in Building Magazine in 2 weeks' time. We've got another forum in a month's time here on the 28th of March, which was based on an article we produced late last year. It's Labs in the Sky, all about the challenges around life science high-rise life science building. Anyone's going to MIPIM? I'll be one of a few of us here going down to MIPIM. I'm also going to be talking about the future of tall buildings at an event down there. And finally, of course, we'll be producing another market report, which I think sort of end of March, April time, something like that. April. And we'll have a forum both on that. I've just committed us to a deadline now, haven't I? But as Mark said earlier, that will be encompassing our wider colleagues at Turner and Townsend as well. So we're kind of excited about that. I'd like to thank everyone online and everyone who made the effort to come here to listen to us, and we'll see you very soon. Thanks.